Hi everyone, good day. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar, the topic is on land acknowledgement. We chose this topic because we would like to heighten awareness of and facilitate a space to talk about it. We'll give you a little bit of background on the description and the learning objectives of today's webinar. Indigenous land acknowledgements at public meetings have become more common in recent years. Some acknowledgements have been criticized as being carrying probably a little bit of no effort or reflection on little information that the speaker or about the speaker's relationship to Indigenous people. The goals of the webinar today are to explain why acknowledgements are important, to tackle the fear issue. Many of us are afraid to get it wrong, and to explain why non-Indigenous persons can or should make acknowledgements. And 3, to engage in reflection and provide tools and resources to create thoughtful acknowledgements that showcase our individual and organizational commitments to respectful relationship building with Indigenous communities. I also want to acknowledge on today's webinar, Trevor Stratton, who has been very instrumental in providing some valuable insight into today's content. Today our presenter is Jacquie Briggs. Jacquie is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto Centre for Criminology and Sociology Studies. Her research focuses on the Department of Indian Affairs historical involvement in the criminal justice system. Jacquie holds a certificate in decolonizing education from the Center of Indigeology. Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she continues to learn best practices for the respectful incorporation of Indigenous knowledges into teaching and learning. Jacquie was born in Toronto. Her ancestors came to Turtle Island seeking opportunity from England and Ireland in the late 1800s and 1950s. Jacquie identifies as a white settler. Over to you, Jacquie, and welcome.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. I'm really excited and, of course, nervous to share the knowledge that I have. I've been studying Indigenous settler relations in Canada for over 10 years now in an academic kind of way, and in the last 2 years, I've been learning more from Indigeology and Indigenous knowledges and working with Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. So I'm really excited to, from that positionality, share what I've started to learn.
Before we, I would just have Chris give us a little bit of housekeeping with regards to questions. Chris, can you?
Absolutely. So what we would like for everybody to do for questions is there is a chat feature within Zoom. If you go to the screen where you see the presentation being displayed, at the bottom of that screen, you will see a chat bubble. If you click on that chat bubble, it'll bring up a window, and just type your message at the bottom at any time throughout the presentation. And there will be a moment at the end of the presentation where I will read out the questions, and Jacquie will provide the answers. If you have any questions or problems during the webinar, please either give me a phone call, 416-364-4555, extension 300, or send me an email. Just reply to the email that I sent you the link to the presentation in. Okay, so thank you very much, and here we go.
Thank you, Chris. Back to Jacquie.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so this is just my title slide, and I've called this presentation Acknowledging Land, Acknowledging Relationships, How to Prepare Meaningful, Respectful, and Appropriate Indigenous Land Acknowledgements. And since Eric has read you my biography already, I'm going to take this opportunity on this slide to provide my land acknowledgement today. my land community acknowledgement. So my name is Jacquie, and I identify as a white settler. My family, lots of my ancestors came from England and Ireland, as Erica said, in the 1800s and in the 1950s, seeking opportunity, because they didn't have opportunity in Ireland and England. I was born here in Toronto, and my parents were born in Toronto, which is, I learned a few years ago when I started my PhD program, the territory of the Dish with One Spoon agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I always want to reflect on the fact that I didn't know that until I got to my PhD. I think it's important because I am a second-generation Toronto person, and the presence, in my experience, of Indigenous peoples had been, in many cases, erased from Toronto, and that was, I think, something intentional that had been done by people like my ancestors to lay claim to the land of Toronto. So I find it very important also to position myself in terms of the work that I'm doing, because the work that I'm doing, my research and my teaching, engage me with Indigenous peoples. So I study the history of the Department of Indian Affairs and the criminal justice system, which is really the study of the role of settlers in colonization and the production of Indigenous over-incarceration, among other consequences of colonialism that we see today. My research, teaching, and learning, my community work all engage me in relationship with Indigenous individuals, communities, and nations. And in this work, I strive to understand myself and to work towards being an ally and in support of Indigenous self-determination. And that can be very complicated, and it can be very challenging, but I'm maintaining my commitment to it, and through activities like today, coming to speak with you all, I'm really excited to be here. That's one way that I'm engaging in this activity. So towards the presentation. So some people might not have actually heard a specific Indigenous land acknowledgement before. Some people might have. I asked my father-in-law in the car on the weekend, for example, if he has ever heard one. And he said no. And I said, he's a member of a golf club, for example. And I said, do they do an Indigenous land acknowledgement at your golf club? And he said, no. So I said, well, I'm going to share my presentation with you, and maybe you would be interested in thinking about the land that your golf club is located on, and what kind of relationships, as people who are using land, might want to engage in with Indigenous communities in that area. And he said he was open to it, so that's kind of an exciting thing for me. So an Indigenous land acknowledgement, from an official definition of it, is a formal statement that recognizes the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And that's what you would understand as a formal land acknowledgement. Sometimes it can be, as Eric pointed out, kind of a script, something that is predetermined by an organization, and it's read or included, for example, in an email signature. And that's okay. But I think we want to do something a little bit more, and probably you're here today because you do want to take that extra step into learning how to create something a little bit more meaningful. Just drinking some water. So we're going to cover today 3 main questions, but really it's a 2-part presentation. So in the first part, we're going to talk about why we make acknowledgements, who should be making acknowledgements, and this is really understanding the role of settlers and non-Indigenous people in making acknowledgements, because there is a role for us in this. And then third, we're going to discuss how to acknowledge, and I'm going to give you guidelines on taking a reflective and relationship-based approach to developing your land acknowledgement for yourself as an individual and for your organization. So I also want to acknowledge my teachers at the Center for Indigeology. There were 2 main faculty there who I've really learned so much from since I started their certificate in the fall of 2017. Dr. Kathy Absalon, her spirit name is Minigojigokwe, and it means shining day woman, the one who brings goodness and beauty to the day. And she really embodies that name. She's such a gift, and she is committed to teaching settlers and non-Indigenous persons how to engage in meaningful, appropriate, and respectful ways. And a lot of what I can present here is from the knowledge that she's shared. And Giselle Diaz, who is also an Anishinaabe and member of the Métis Nation, is the program coordinator at the Center for Indigeology, and she is absolutely vital to helping the work of that center move forward. And I owe a lot to them, so I wanted to acknowledge them today. So this is the big question. And for years, even after I had learned what the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant was, what were the kind of legal Toronto treaties called the Toronto Purchase, and who were the peoples who were here in the Toronto area, I still felt really, really nervous to make my own land acknowledgement. And often I would have a friend and I'd say, okay, you do it, we're running a meeting. I say, okay, you do it, I don't want to do it today. Because it's a scary kind of process to put yourself out there. And part of the reason why it's scary is because it can go badly and then you can be criticized. And we just have to be open about that because, we've seen even a few weeks ago at Toronto Pride, that's why I included this image, the Toronto Pride acknowledgement that they had was criticized for not specifically acknowledging the Mississaugas of New Credit, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee people, for example. And I saw this little sign when I was at Pride, and I think 3 tents down, Mississaugas of New Credit did have a tent, so they were there, but they weren't in the acknowledgement. So I just want to validate these concerns that many of us are feeling, and we can kind of work together, and you can work with your communities and your groups to figure out how to do something meaningful. And when you know you have something meaningful, it's probably going to be a little bit less scary. So why should we acknowledge? So there's 2 main reasons why I think we should acknowledge. There are going to be lots of other reasons that people could come up with, and I would love to hear some of them in the question and answer, actually, if you want to provide additional reasons, because that's a courage building exercise, if you can think of all the reasons why we want to provide those acknowledgements. So I can't actually see all of my screen. So something that's on the right, can I take this off? Sorry, I'm just going to fiddle with this for a second. Small. Perfect. Now I can see the slide. Okay. So the number 1 reason I feel to make an acknowledgement is to demonstrate respect. And I have a quotation from a student kind of land acknowledgement guide from Wilfrid Laurier that I thought really captured what I was going for here. So to recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation for those whose territory you reside on, and is a way to honor the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is also a way to express your intentions specifically as an individual and as an organization. It is a communication of your respectful intention, which enables the people, if you think about an actual meeting where you might be doing this, there will be potentially Indigenous persons in the audience who can understand your intentions because you have communicated them. If you haven't communicated them, they don't necessarily know what your goals are. And that enables one of the principles of decolonization, which is Indigenous self-determination. We provide information so that Indigenous peoples can self-determine what kind of relationship they would like to engage in with me as an individual, with my organization, and with my institution, for example. So when you're making a land acknowledgement, it is a signal. It is, to a degree, some kind of performance, but it is an important performance of your intention. It doesn't have to be performance in a bad way. It's a good thing to make that expression. So who should acknowledge? Now it's important, one of the teachings I have from Dr. Kathy Absalon is that the work of decolonization is one set of work for Indigenous peoples. It is another set of work for settlers and non-Indigenous peoples. But there is a role for us in decolonization, in solidarity and in alliance. So it is important for us to understand, as settlers, migrants who came more recently, I would call myself a settler because my family has been here for a long time. migrants who came more recently, and even visitors, someone visiting from Australia or Europe or Asia, for example, to understand the history that has brought you to reside on this land and to seek to understand your place in that history. We are all implicit in colonialism. We are all part of these structures that continue to exist. And if we understand them, we can start to take actions to move out of them. So specifically, the person who is hosting, introducing, or who called the meeting, for example, will often make the statement of acknowledgement. And an example that I provide here stands out to me because it was very meaningful at the time. It was the first time I had heard a very senior academic person provide a spoken acknowledgement without a script that really felt meaningful, in which he positioned himself in relation to the treaty area of Calgary, in relation to the work of the law school in reconciliation, and in himself in terms of his own history of migration into Canada. And that was a really important example, and it still stands out, I guess, 2 years later, as a good example of a settler making a land acknowledgement. And I really want to point out that there were no Indigenous people participating in that conference that I was in. It was a legal history conference. But it was important for this dean of the law school to make that acknowledgement anyways. I have conversely been in other meetings where the topic is Indigenous research, research that settlers have done on Indigenous topics, and there have been no Indigenous people in the room, and they have not acknowledged. And it leaves a little bit of a wonder about why they chose not to do it in that space as opposed to other spaces. So it's something to keep in mind when you want to acknowledge, but it's probably always a good time to acknowledge. That's my opinion. So the issue with the formal acknowledgements is that a lot of them need work. So I'm going to have 2 slides here where we look at 2 kind of scripted, officially approved university land acknowledgements, and we're going to talk about what's missing from them. So the first one is from my university, and this is approved by council and the president and everyone. So this is the official script that you would read, they say, at the opening of a building or something like that, but people read this all the time now. So we're going to read it. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So there's some things missing from this acknowledgement, and I think it's for issues of pronunciation. I think the university is hesitant to want to ask its very senior officials to want to say the names of the Indigenous nations, of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. So they use Seneca instead of Haudenosaunee, and they use Mississaugas of Credit River instead of Anishinaabe. The Mississaugas are part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And that's one example of an acknowledgement that could use a little bit more thoughtful work and does not include any personal details at all about the role of the university, for example, in reconciliation. So our next example is from Ryerson University, and it's a little bit different. So theirs reads, Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So this is the land acknowledgement that I heard when I was in my first year of my PhD, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have never heard something about the Dish with One Spoon before. This is so interesting. So I initially had a great impression of this land acknowledgement. However, the author of this land acknowledgement, Hayden King, who is an Indigenous professor of political science, I believe, who still works at Ryerson University, and who kind of co-authored this acknowledgement, recently stated, and this was in January of this year, that he regrets writing it. And I'm quoting the article here. who are we really to invite anybody into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty? For me personally, I think I started to see how the territorial acknowledgement could become very superficial and how it sort of fetishizes these actual, tangible, concrete treaties. They're not metaphors, they're real institutions. So his criticism of his own work here is that the Dish with One Spoon Treaty is a real law, it's a real institution, and if we read it from a script but don't know about it and can't participate in it in a meaningful way, then it does a disservice to us as settlers thinking we're engaging, and to Indigenous peoples who are party to that treaty. So even within Indigenous communities, there is some contention. So I have two more examples of things that can go wrong, but then we're going to get into what we can do right, I promise. So we're going a little over time, but we're gonna get there. So recently, especially since the example of the Pride land acknowledgement, I think in the last few weeks there's been a lot more coverage of land acknowledgements in the news, for example, in the Globe and Mail, and it's been called in a few places an empty gesture, or I had used the word perfunctory in the description of this webinar. So there is definitely potential for land acknowledgement to be an empty gesture. And it's important that we don't let that keep us from doing it. So Dr. Sheila Cope-Meek, who will be starting in the fall at York University, I believe as President of Indigenous Relations, a very senior position, something like that, stated in this Globe and Mail article recently that she welcomes a debate about the practice because she believes land acknowledgements are worth preserving. She doesn't want us to give up. And the reason she says this is because the idea that land acknowledgement has become a merely symbolic gesture is giving some people an excuse not to do it. Any excuse not to acknowledge Indigenous people, some people will take it. So this is part of the fear also. Fear might keep us, fear might make us want to make excuses so that we don't do it. But it's important to also note that, just like I said about this other research meeting I have been to where no one made an acknowledgement, people notice. So Andre Picard, who is a health journalist in the Globe and Mail, he's a wonderful journalist, wrote when the Ontario Medical Association, which is the Physicians Association, voted down a motion to open meetings with an acknowledgement. So they decided not to start any of their board meetings or conferences with an acknowledgement of Indigenous territory. He said it makes the Ontario Medical Association look glib, wallowing in their privilege, and worst of all, indifferent to the all-important issue of reconciliation. Land acknowledgements are only a token gesture if they're done thoughtlessly and by rote from a script. So we don't want that. We want to empower you to not have, you can have notes like I read from notes, but it's not a script. It's not something that someone else wrote for me. So in part 2 of this presentation, what I'm providing here is a lot of questions for you and your organization to take them and go back and engage in reflection about all of these different things I'm raising now, and you can work to make your own personalized, genuine, meaningful land acknowledgement that will hopefully serve your purposes and enable you to begin or continue to engage with Indigenous communities in a meaningful way. So there's 2 parts to this. There's research, which is what I did for the first 10 years, and now there's reflection, which is what I've been doing for the last 2 years, for example. And I think we can think of this in terms of learning and teaching in 2 different ways. This is another teaching from Dr. Kathy Absalon. So seeking knowledge is one thing, but seeking understanding is a whole other level. And this is, I think, in the criticism of scripted land acknowledgements, I think this is what the criticism really is. It shows a lack of understanding of that individual and that organization when they just read a script. So when you engage in knowledge seeking as a research process, you are, and I'm giving a quotation from a Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, which is inclusive in terms of, the work of Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance. It includes this report two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people. So it's a very inclusive report, and I encourage everyone to read it. And they call on all Canadians, it's called a call to justice for all Canadians, to decolonize by learning the true history of Canada and Indigenous history in your local area. They call on us to learn about and celebrate Indigenous peoples' history, cultures, pride, and diversity, and to acknowledge the land that we live on and its importance to local Indigenous communities historically and today. So they're calling on us to engage in this reflective, understanding, seeking process if we're going to make a land acknowledgement, and they're calling on us to engage in land acknowledgements because they feel it is important. So understanding seeking is not necessarily a process, although there might be research involved. It's a reflective process, and that's what I'm going to kind of demonstrate how you can engage in that in the next slides. So the first stage is I know there are people from all over Ontario joining the call today. This is not a Toronto-centric presentation, even though I have the CN Tower in the image. So you're going to ask yourself, where am I? So who are, and this is a knowledge-seeking kind of practice that you're going to engage in. Who are the Indigenous peoples where we are located? What treaties or other agreements exist between these peoples and the Government of Canada? Or, for example, are there any land claims currently filed? And specifically, what have been the experiences of Indigenous peoples in the location where you are? Did a residential school or Indian hospital, for example, for tuberculosis, operate in the vicinity? And then think about the present. What Indigenous community services are now available, just for youth centers? The next step for your reflection is to think about, who am I? And here you're seeking knowledge in terms of research of your family history, but also understanding of your location and experiences within that history. Everyone is Indigenous to somewhere, but not everyone is Indigenous to Turtle Island. So I would be Indigenous to England and Ireland, for example. Eric is Indigenous to Trinidad via Africa, and maybe other mixtures. And it's important to learn that history and to learn the histories of migration. Some people in Canada who've been here for a long time, they actually don't know their histories of migration. And I think it's important, even if you don't know, to reflect on why you don't know and what this means in terms of your identity as a Canadian, as a non-Indigenous person, as a settler. And then ask yourself, how and why did you come to reside specifically in the place where you currently live? Were you pursuing work opportunities, education, cultural experiences? Were you born there? And then to think about why you stay. Is it because of your work or to be close to your family and friends? And then the most important part is to reflect on why this kind of information would be important knowledge for Indigenous individuals and communities to know about you. Why might they want to know when they're meeting me, for example, that I'm Irish and English ancestry? Why might they want to know that I identify as white and a settler? It can be very, very important for the types of relationships that you want to engage in and the types of interactions that you're going to have for people to have that knowledge. So it's about understanding myself and sharing that intention. So the next part is where you can kind of translate this also into your organization work and into your institution. So it's personal and it's work also. So when we're seeking understanding of our roles and relationships, we're thinking about who are our communities. So I think we're members of constellations of communities. It's not just one community, such as white straight women. I'm not just a member of one community. I'm a member of lots. Every time I have an interaction, it's as a member of a community. So I encourage all of you to map out your communities, personal and organizational, to enrich your self-understanding as both an individual and as a member of an organization. And doing this mapping process can help deepen your understanding of how you are engaged with Indigenous individuals and communities in all of your different interactions. Once you know the interactions that you have, you can think about what your responsibilities are in these different relationships. Think about how you can build on them, how you can strengthen them, and most importantly, what kind of actions can you make within those relations to move towards what you might call reconciliation or decolonization or solidarity or alliance today. So I'm going to give you an example because that doesn't necessarily explain what is a community constellation. So these are my examples of a lot of the different communities that I am identified with. So as a student and educator in this PhD program that I'm in at the University of Toronto, I'm in relationship with my students because I work as a teaching assistant and I work as a course instructor. I'm in relations with my peer students in the PhD program, with my peer educators who are also teaching courses, with the university administrators, with faculty and supervisors, and with all of my colleagues at the Center for Indigeology. As a researcher, a very important set of communities, I'm in relationship with my research partners who I work with alongside, with the editors and peer reviewers who are evaluating my work, with the research subjects who I'm studying, with funding agencies, and with the readers who are going to read and share and think about the work that I'm producing. As a family member, I'm in relationship with my daughter's school. My daughter's 7, she's so cute. With my partner's work community, with our extended families, that I mean bio families and chosen families, with our neighbors and with our friends. And all of these relations that are italicized are relations in which I have identified that I have relationships with Indigenous individuals and communities. And in these relationships, I'm very, very conscious of my responsibilities to work in solidarity and alliance. And I'm conscious of how my inherited social location and my chosen identities affect these actions. And this is part of the determination aspect of demonstrating my intentions. So my identities and social location as a white person, as a settler person, as a straight person, as a cisgendered, able-bodied, able-minded, privileged person are going to affect the relationships that I'm able to create, and also the ways that people might want to interact with me or not interact with me, to be very honest. Sometimes people don't want to interact with me, and that's okay, because that's their self-determination. And I'm going to respect those choices based on the information that I provide, because I know I've provided my information, and it's not up to force things. So I encourage everyone to kind of mapping out process and just sit with it for a little while. Think about how that might affect the work that you're doing as an organization, and also the kinds of information that you're going to share or that you want to share in something like the land acknowledgement. So we're kind of getting to the conclusion now. So you'll see that in my kind of criticism of a formal scripted land acknowledgement, often it can be about land. It's kind of only about land, and land is absolutely central to Indigenous nations, Indigenous self-determination, and to decolonization. But for non-Indigenous and settler people, there's another aspect of land acknowledgements that we need to do, and that's about identifying ourselves, identifying our community relationships, our responsibilities, and our actions. So maybe we can not even think of it as a land acknowledgement, and to think of it as a land-community relationship acknowledgement. And I think that's a better way for us to think about how to make something meaningful when we're creating these things. So this is a recap of, kind of the basic that you're going to want to start to ask yourself. But the most important parts of creating a meaningful land acknowledgement are to do your research, that's your knowledge seeking, engage in reflection, that's your understanding seeking, and to speak from the heart, that's the courage part, is to, it's not easy, I'm nervous every time I do it because it means something to me. And I think it's good. You want to have that courage because you're hopefully doing something meaningful when you have that fear, and then you overcome it with the courage. So I won't read out these questions again, but you're going to have those all with you so you can look at them again and look at the other questions I've provided through the other slides. And I think we're going to go into questions now. So I welcome all of your questions about, anything you want to ask me. And I'm really thank you for listening. And I want to say in Anishinaabe, Chimigwech, which means thank you for participating today.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And as now, we will go back to the format in which Chris earlier directed. So all questions are welcome now.
Okay, so we've received one question from Jordan. I had a question why we were doing land acknowledgement at a men's group I was running, as it was a group for gay men and substance use. It ended up being a great conversation about why we did it, and was a moment for me to reflect on how not all of us are even aware of the need for them / not just to do by rote. I was grateful for that moment because it jolted me out of some passivity. I really appreciated the community constellation tool. This was very meaningful.
Thank you, Chris.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
It's like a tool. Oh, I really appreciate that. Can I reflect on that for a second?
Oh, absolutely.
That's great. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Jordan, because I went to another event at the Law Society of Ontario, and at this event, there were a lot of speeches, and there was a dinner, and it was all lawyers and law professors there, and me. And what they did not provide a land acknowledgement. And I thought, okay, that's interesting to be in this, hall of power, because lawyers definitely know what they're doing when they're acknowledging Indigenous land. Like, these are people who are working against the land claims or for land claims, so they don't speak words lightly when it has to do with land, power, property ownership. But what they did instead of acknowledging land was we all stood up and we toasted the Queen as the head of state. And I thought, okay, this is something different than I'm used to at the University of Toronto. So it really matters. And if I had heard a land acknowledgement in that space, it would have been even more meaningful. Because it would be a place where it was kind of a disruption. It was something new for them. So I would have liked to hear that a lot. And the fact that I didn't hear it means something. So I definitely appreciate that comment about where they're not used to it, or this is actually new knowledge. It means a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so again, if anybody has any questions, please go to the chat bubble at the bottom of the presentation screen and type your question in there, and we will read it out.
Or maybe we could ask them a question and they could provide an answer. Which is, do you think I guess there's two things. So one thing that might keep us from making an acknowledgement is definitely fear, but part of the fear is that we don't have the knowledge. We don't have the knowledge base to really understand how to do it. And I have provided, I closed the screen already, but the last slide in the presentation is links to different resources. And in those resources, you can actually go in and type the city that you're in, for example, and it will tell you the website called Whose Land and another website called Native Land. And you can type your city and they will let you know which treaty area you're in, who are the Indigenous nations in that area, which Indigenous languages are spoken in that area, and then you can kind of take the steps to do more research on that. So some of the map images that I had shown with all of the different colors, for example, those are examples of how these websites work, Native Land and Whose Land. And they're really, really useful for kind of taking that first step for where actually am I? Who are the Indigenous people here? Is there a treaty? Because some places there is not a treaty. So if that's one step. Yeah.
Okay, we actually have another question here. Do only non-Indigenous people do land acknowledgements? And the second part of the question is, do people only do land acknowledgements in Turtle Island or other settler colonial nations around the globe?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't traveled that much around the world, so I think it is a growing practice. I know we had like a really wonderful opening ceremony at a conference that we held here in Toronto last summer, and we had Elder Wendy Phillips and her husband has a grandfather drum group, so they did a drum circle, and she provided a teaching, and she actually gave her own acknowledgement, but the settler person who introduced her, who was the president of the organization, also provided his own acknowledgement just before hers. So I guess the idea is you don't want to, if you're bringing in an Indigenous elder or knowledge keeper to open your event with a ceremony, that is a wonderful thing to do if you have cultivated that relationship, but that is not the land acknowledgement from a non-Indigenous person. The non-Indigenous person, as a representative of their organization or as a representative of themselves, should also give their own acknowledgement that identifies themselves and their work and what approach they're taking, or really lets people know what level of knowledge you're at. Like where are you in your learning journey about all of this? And it's okay to say, for example, just like I did, I only learned about the dish with one spoon 4 years ago. And my hope is that an Indigenous person who hears that in the audience will understand that I'm starting my journey and that I'm really working hard to get somewhere. And will understand that I don't have all the answers. And you don't just read one book and become an expert. This is a lifelong kind of journey, but it's important to take that first step, right? So I don't know about people around the globe making acknowledgements, but Indigenous peoples have their own protocols and their own ways of understanding, if someone, an Anishinaabe person who's in this place in Ontario, travels to British Columbia, for example, they will introduce themselves usually as an Anishinaabe person who's visiting in British Columbia on the land of the Chilcotin, for example, and they'll acknowledge that they're a visitor there. But that's kind of a little bit different than what I'm talking about today, which is to really understand as a non-Indigenous person how you can kind of take these first steps into making an acknowledgement. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent. So there aren't any further questions, but there's still time if you'd like to type a question in the chat window.
Or they could maybe answer a long question that I had before, which was, what do you think is mostly keeping you from giving an acknowledgement? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it kind of that fear of getting it wrong? It's important to know so that you can, that's part of your reflection process, I guess. For me, it was fear of getting it wrong mostly, because I did have a lot of like factual knowledge, but I didn't want to embarrass myself by seeming that I didn't know what I was talking about. So that's what kept me for a long time from wanting to make a land acknowledgement. So I would be very interested to know for all the people who participate today, whether it is a knowledge issue, if it's maybe fear, or what else it could be. Because it could definitely be anything else from anyone's experience. So you could type that in, I guess, and Chris could tell us anonymously.
Hey, Chris? Chris?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, if we aren't getting any answers, we are going to close out. Are there any answers coming in?
There is one question or one statement. For me, over the last few years of my understanding of who should deliver land acknowledgements has grown. There's another comment. I've been making them, but ended up often lecturing people, not discussing my own personal connection and implications. So there's some work to do for me there. Another comment is I've been hesitant to make land acknowledgements depending on the setting and the organization, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I had given a different version of this presentation 2 years ago to I would call them peer educators, other teaching assistants. We were kind of helping each other to learn different things. And when I gave the presentation on how to make a land acknowledgement, which was very specific to Toronto, someone from the Faculty of Public Health who worked in dentistry issues, she said to me, I've heard these before, but don't you think it's too political? If I make an acknowledgement at a conference, for example, are people going to see me as a radical, politicized person when really I just work in dentistry? And I said, you know, that's a good question. I don't know how they're going to perceive you because I don't know your community, but that's the courage part. You know, as you deepen your knowledge and you deepen your understanding, what I find is that as people do that, their commitment to working in alliance and to working in solidarity really grows the more that they learn. And then you're, I guess, more willing to make that step and to, I guess, put yourself out there, because you're kind of putting yourself out there depending on the setting in which you would be making the land acknowledgement. Like my father-in-law, for example, if he decides to make a land acknowledgement at his golf club, that's going to be a big deal. You know, if a farmer at his wheat growing association in Saskatchewan decided to make a land acknowledgement, that would be a big deal. Where I am every day, it's become fairly common to hear the scripted land acknowledgement. It's less common to hear a meaningful, personalized relationship and responsibility acknowledgement. And I think that's the kind of place where we should go. And that I think that's what our non-Indigenous responsibility is, to really start to identify ourselves. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Okay, we've got another question. Is there anything that should not be included in a land acknowledgement? And the second part is, have you had any experiences pushing back against administration who don't want to do a land acknowledgement? If so, what strategies do you recommend for getting through this?
Oh, that's very interesting. So in terms of what should not be included, I would just say, even though you are identifying yourself, you don't want to make it like all about you. This is not the time to talk about like how your grandmother left and it was really sad and, you know, kind of like becoming a victim in a way. That's not what you want to do. You want to engage in a practice of sharing who you are and the work that you do and what your commitments are, essentially. However that is in terms of what stage you're at. But try not to make it too much about you in like a selfish way. I know there's a balance to be struck because I'm asking you to identify who you are, but that is kind of a fine balance. So the more that you go to, you know, different Indigenous events, spaces, Indigenous spaces, you're going to hear more land acknowledgements. Like come to the university, we have a lot of free open events. So you'll hear them there and you'll get a sense of what you might be comfortable saying and how far you want to go. In terms of feedback from administrators, that's really interesting. In my experience, administrators really want, maybe it's different in the university, they really want to do the right thing, but they don't know what to do. So they're quite happy for people to do that work, to take those initial steps, to do the research, and to start developing an acknowledgement. And I think the same things apply at the administrator level, decision-making level, to the service delivery level, to, you know, the high up official level. Everyone's afraid to kind of get it wrong. And, you know, I criticize my own university. I say, your land acknowledgement is no good. You need to do better. So of course they're going to be reluctant to put themselves out there. But taking that first step is really important. And if for you, the first step is to just read something off of a script, that's a good thing, because that's step one. And you'd be more comfortable going into those next, you know, you're in the knowledge level, you're going to go to the understanding level as you learn more and you do more. So I would say if you prepare something and you can show and demonstrate your knowledge to your administrators, they might be interested in, you know, having a meeting about it, having a group discussion about it, talking about what are the goals of your organization in terms of working with Indigenous communities and individuals. Like if you're providing services, for example, it might be very important that you to undertake that identification process so that those people can understand you are an organization that is working towards knowledge and understanding and, you know, to supporting Indigenous self-determination in those interactions that you have. I hope that answers the question. I would just encourage you to, you know, have that courage and keep, yeah, because they might be afraid too.
Okay, so there's one last comment here stating, I provide workshops on mental health and learning challenges to youth volunteers, and it was after some problematic feedback about lifestyles on reserves contributing to mental illness that I felt compelled to make land acknowledgements after that.
That's great. Yeah, so that's a way that you're really connecting your work with the role that you have in participating in this kind of discussion. So I think that's wonderful. Yeah. So I'm so grateful for everyone to share their experiences, because this is part of it, you know, it's part of the fear too, like I don't want to talk about it, I don't have a role. But one thing I really learned from, well, I'm going to say two things I learned from Dr. Kathy Absalon and Giselle Diaz. The first one is, and she strongly believes this, is that everyone is affected by colonialism, settlers and Indigenous peoples. And that she has this great saying, she says, you don't know what you don't know. What is outside of your knowledge, like in Jordan's comment, you don't even know what you're missing if you've never been exposed to certain types of history, certain experiences of people that you've never met, for example. And the second thing, so kind of go easy on yourself if you don't know what you don't know, and just start learning, because there's a lot of resources out there. And the second thing is that Indigenous peoples have their own work to do in terms of decolonization. That's the resurgence of their communities, you know, going back to the land. But there is a different work for non-Indigenous people that we can do in decolonization, in reconciliation. Like Indigenous settler relations in Canada is not a, you know, it takes two to tango, right? So we have a lot of work to do as settler people. And I find that to be empowering to know that I do have a role. My role is not to boss anybody around. It is not to decide what's best for someone else. But my role is to seek the knowledge out and to understand what I'm doing and to provide, like for example right now, to provide some information to hopefully enable other persons to start on that journey as well. So you don't know what you don't know, and settlers do have a role. And I find those two things to be kind of comforting, but also give me a lot of courage in terms of doing the work that I want to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions, Chris?
No, that was the last comment that has come in.
Okay, great. Well, we are 7 minutes away from the hour, so at this time I'm going to close out. I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to do this, to participate in this webinar. I hope that you walk away from this making a commitment to doing a more personalized sort of land acknowledgement and getting better understanding and knowledge how to do so, including organization as well. I want to thank Trevor Stratton again, who is an Indigenous person who was who helped us through this process with his insights. And finally, I want to thank Jacqueline too for taking her time to facilitate this and bring us to life in a short space of time working to get this together. So thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you, Chris, also for helping us.
My pleasure.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Bye now.